myself. I work at a large healthcare company. You can look me up on LinkedIn if you're interested. Senior Director of Governance, Risk, and Compliance. I'm also a European Data Protection Officer registered in Europe. Got a Master's of Science and a few certifications. I've been speaking, mentoring, and volunteering for the last 8 years in cybersecurity. Before that, I was a lurker in cybersecurity, doing red team, blue team type stuff. Then I started getting into the management and have been doing well ever since. Bit about the why for tabletop exercises. In short, I'm a big Simon Sinek fan. Always start with why. Why do we do this? Where's the value proposition? We do tabletop exercises because it makes us a more resilient company. It makes us more resilient to respond to high stakes situations. Tabletop exercises, specifically the way I'm leveraging this, it can be leveraged for not just IT instant response, but also physical response to things like an active shooter or things like disgruntled employee, things like employees, termination of an employee, things like that. So scalability across the board, it's not just meant for IT, it's meant for multiple participants across the business line, business leadership as well. And as far as what a real life scenario is, when doing a tabletop exercise, you would like to make this as real as possible. In many cases, the practitioner who's executing the tabletop exercise may not be a IT red teamer or blue teamer on the incident response team specifically. They may be more on the facility side of the house. But bringing in, sort of as you plan for a tabletop exercise, the right people to the conversation and say, what are the things that we've experienced in the last year that are meaningful that we can talk through and do better, and then provide that scenario as this is the way forward. And then the way we do this is by doing it in a low stakes scenario. When I say low stakes scenario, it's not a scenario where you're actually performing a thing. You're more or less having a conversation about a thing happening, specifically an incident that's happening, and how to triage that and how to do that in a way where you uncover sort of, I call it the black swan type of things that your company didn't realize were either available to you to do, or a black swan that could be an issue that you didn't see before. So as far as the low stakes practices and exercises, you want to make sure that that the right people are a part of that conversation. So looking at this again, back to the why, planning ahead of time before an exercise or high stakes type of situation comes up. Understand that there's a plan, create a plan, and understand that there's a baseline as well, and what that baseline looks to be like. And it's more costly financially, emotionally, in some cases, if you're learning to do on the as the incident's happening. You don't want to be experiencing that without knowing who the right people are to contact, the communication tree, and as well as what to do in a situation. This can be the same experience for a fire drill all the way to a cyber incident, right? So what it is, jumping into what it is exactly that a tabletop is and isn't. A tabletop exercise is a safe place. It's a safe place for everybody in the room, and it's not a place to sort of argue and create, challenges. It's the whole purpose of the exercise is to create solutions and opportunities for improvement. It's not a live fire exercise. It is not a penetration test. We're not testing we're not kicking the windows on the house. We're not trying to open the windows. It's not a place to train as well. So I've seen in my experiences where tabletop, let's train and do the exercise thing right now. We're not, that's really not the purpose of a tabletop exercise. The tabletop exercise is to learn what to do and when to do it. And a big part of that is building the relationships and the communications with other people. And because of COVID, everybody in the last 2 years has experienced COVID and the disparate communication that we have with our coworkers via Zoom, via Teams, via any one of the communication platforms we leverage on our computers. There's also been a disconnect in how we communicate. So it's part of this is communicating and understanding that, as we come back to the office, as we come back to supporting the organization in a physical space, that it is a process of communicating in a way that we haven't done in about 2 years, right? And then global participation. If you're a global company, a national company, international company, or just a local business, a high participation rate of leadership, of directors, managers, executive staff, and as well as vendors and platforms that you leverage to support resiliency for the organization. If you're in a building, in some cases, you can reach out to the landlord, say, hey, can you help me out with this tabletop exercise? I would like to walk through a few things, such as a fire drill, or such as evacuating the building to undue circumstance, that sort of thing. Or more specifically, in a cyber incident response, if you're working with Microsoft as an example, and I don't want to favor them too much, but working with a cloud vendor, bring the cloud vendor in as part of this conversation. They have professional services, supporting services that can help you walk through a scenario. What are the tools that are available to you as a company that you may not even be aware of from an incident response standpoint, specifically from an incident response to a cyber attack, incident response to a ransomware, incident response to any one of the, hey, we have something serious in response to a breach, escalated all the way to the breach where you need forensic responders to come in and help you with the forensic side of the house. Not just stop the bleeding, but record what's going on from an instant response standpoint and a forensic standpoint. Beyond that, looking at the exercise objectives, you want to assess your capabilities and the organizational departments that are part of those capabilities, and look at what you already have planned as an organization versus what is the actual process that's being implemented. And then those procedures beneath that. So if does somebody know what to do if somebody shows up to the building without a badge and they're just walking around without a badge and nobody really knows who that person is? Reviewing the information and then disseminating that, right? So everybody should have a good understanding of what the incident response plan is for the organization in case of inclement weather, right? So there on the East Coast, we get hurricanes. Here in the central United States, they get blizzards and sometimes bad storms and tornadoes. And then on the West Coast, you get earthquakes. Disseminating the right information to the critical systems, the critical people that support the critical systems is very important. And seconds in some cases mean life or death, right? So being able to have the right people, the right place with the right tools. In some cases, you can have one of the tools we leverage for our company is a text messaging system, real basic, text messaging system. So if inclement weather comes in, that could be adverse for people coming into the office. They're notified by text, hey, inclement weather, please don't come to the office, right? Or hey, we've had in some cases we had you could have but some cases you could say, well, there's been a COVID outbreak or a new variant of COVID outbreak, and don't come to the office because we're sanitizing the office. And then not just the physical side, but the logical threat initiated, and then coordinating those activities. In most cases, the basic question is, do we have a policy to support this? Do we have a process to support it? Do we have the people to support that as well, right? So let's talk about core capabilities. When you're doing a tabletop exercise, you're leveraging instant response, operational planning, operational communication, internal communication, intelligence and information sharing, risk management, public information, public warnings, and physical protective measures. So you'll cover all those. If you're doing a good tabletop exercise, and sometimes it may take multiple exercises, you'll cover all of these bases in a level that you could not get anywhere else otherwise, to build that resiliency to the company, to build that resiliency to the organization, and help instill a good sense of a plan and what to do when adversity impacts the company. Talk about roles. So with a tabletop exercise, you've got called big four roles. You got the players of the tabletop exercise who are actively discussing things. You have the observers who are just there to really not wholly directly participate, but may support in player responses. I call it phone a friend. Hey, I need to call so and so to help me out with this. As an observer, in some cases, that a vendor can be an observer where they're in and just supporting it. Operational IT operations or facilities is a good example. Facilitators, tabletop exercise is an example. In my role, I'm usually the facilitator for tabletop exercises, and you have what's called a planning team that helps support that. So helps you to clear, hey, is this a good tabletop exercise? What are the things that would be most beneficial to the company as far as what they want to see from a tabletop exercise and the resiliency for it? What are the biggest benefactors of that exercise, such as the business units themselves? And then the data collectors. So I call it the typical take a look at the notes and doing critical evaluations of the responses. As you get toward the end of the tabletop exercise, you'll have what's an after action report that needs to be conducted, and you can say, okay, here's how we can improve. Here's where we are currently, and here's where we can improve upon the exercise or for our next exercise. Organizational resiliency. As far as exercise structures, some of the three areas I've seen some of the best results have been response to an alert, response to a breach, response to an insider threat on site. As we'll look and dig into the scenarios a little bit deeper, I've got one scenario here, and we'll talk through that response to alert. But then we'll open the door as we get into this to questions to look at how would you how would you deal with this sort of situation? How would you deal with this situation? And what plans do you have that are there? What policies, what documentation you have to respond to an incident? And issue-based discussions. So this goes back to a safe place from a discussion standpoint. When you get a large group of people, some people can be very emotional about their response to some of these issues. And so, being as the facilitator, if you're in that role and or a participant or observer, part of the challenge is to ensure that people are very well listened to, and more specifically that you can help to address those issues during the exercise and raise questions that are provocative, and sometimes they can be emotionally charged. But as a facilitator, part of that role and part of the planning team is to help remediate any sort of emotionally charged issues that are brought up, and come back to the where's the focus area for the conversation for the exercise, and it's on the incident, how to respond to it. And the facilitators, again, managing the time as well as far as the conversation goes, and then what that hot wash, if it's a multiple scenario type of conversation, managing the time and managing what the after action conversation needs to look like. As far as the guidelines, you want to set known guidelines for the participants and everybody that's a part of the tabletop exercise. Again, everybody needs to know that this is a low stress, open, no fault environment. We're not here to point fingers. This is an exploration of what we have currently and how do we do better. Many of the conversations as you grow as a company, as you manage, if you're a people manager or manage systems, how do we do better for the future? How do we plan ahead? Because we're planning ahead for our employees, we're planning ahead for our clients, and ultimately we're planning ahead to be a more resilient and safe organization. So people look to you as a guide for how to do better and be a leader for your industry vertical. So the low stress, no fault environment. And then you're responding with your current plans. If there's not a plan, that's where you start. If you don't have the capability or insights, that's a good place to start, is start documenting those. And then are there policies and procedures in place to support these activities? In many cases, there's always, well, we haven't looked at this policy in 2 or 3 years, right? Especially because of COVID and the impact of COVID, people have not been to the office. So in a facilities evacuation standpoint, or headquarters evacuation standpoint, people really, because they haven't exercised that in a couple of years, may not know what to do or how to do it. So communication is key there. And in these scenarios, it's continuous improvement and to do better. And then the identification of those suggestions and taking those as if you're the note taker, if you will, documenting those and say, okay, I've got this. A big part of the conversation is I've documented your concern or issue, and we'll, if it's not pertinent to the conversation or to the focus of the exercise, we'll take that offline and take it, and move that to a different time so you can explore that if you need to, if it's relevant. So some of the assumptions. This is where it starts to get interesting. The adversary and the events are fictional, and you cannot express that enough to the audience. Is that this is a fictional scenario, and this is not reflecting what is actually happening for the business. And why is that important? Because when you start doing a scenario or an exercise, if a participant is not paying attention, they'll again become emotional and have an emotionally charged conversation that it could have been avoided as you provided the assumptions to the audience, right? As well as the exercise is a plausible exercise to the company and it has meaning to the company. Again, for the pre-planning before you move into the tabletop exercise, make sure it's relevant to what it is and valuable to the audience, right? And bringing that value to the audience as far as building the resiliency for the company. And expressing to the audience that there's no hidden agendas, there's no trick questions, there's no bad questions, and everybody from a participant standpoint receives information at the same time, as far as the exercise go. So, looking at the scenario, response to an alert, and what does the scenario even look like? Or it's usually a dialogue, right? So it's like, hey, this thing has happened, and this is how we execute the scenario. So for this scenario, welcome back to the office. As everybody's coming back to the office, some employees have been reporting phishing attempts, and the security team is like, we're getting phishing attempts. What do you do in that scenario, right? As an example, a typical mid-sized company, they'll receive about 1 million a day, right? 1 million phishing attempts a day in some cases. And those aren't targeted phishing attempts, right? So how successful are those? Well, may have a CEO of a company, may have a bad morning, hits a phishing email, and then wasn't quite awake, didn't drink a full cup of coffee, and then boom, he's got malware on his computer. And as far as the adversary goes, they didn't know what hit them, right? So it's spyware, right? So from a scenario standpoint, I just use this fictional date, but Maze ransomware is an actual ransomware. This has affected many companies across the board, and this is what a typical ransomware looks like. This is the message that pops up specifically for Maze. This is what people have seen from Maze. And this is again what I've used in the past as far as a good example for a scenario. So everybody's familiar with ransomware. Specifically, there's been a 400% increase in ransomware in the last year, 2021. With the 400% increase in ransomware, everybody that was unsecure is getting pounded with different variations of ransomware. With the Maze ransomware specifically, that variant, their help desk is fantastic. You get them the ransom, they give you your encrypted information back, and everybody's copacetic, right? But in this scenario, specifically with the ransomware, it has now infected, more than just your computer. It's infecting multiple computers within your organization. And as far as the Maze ransomware, the first person may get the little green message. The second person will get this message, right? And so this is what the The message looks like when it pops up on your screen. If you've never had ransomware pop up on your screen, this is exactly what it looks like. And this is who to contact in case you get mazed for this specific variant, right? At airmail.cc and at tutanota.com. So this is exactly what a ransomware would look like when it popped up on your screen. You got 72 hours. It's going to, to respond. As far as the encryption, some companies have said, hey, I want to break the encryption. This is RSA 2048. Unless you're the NSA, you're not going to break that encryption. So in those scenarios, in this specific scenario, how do we respond to this as a company, right? So what are some of the open discussion questions? It goes back to, do we have a policy? Do we have standards? Do we have procedures? Do we have plans? And which ones apply to the scenario, right? So in a ransomware type of attack, a company will have an information security management program. Especially if you're a mid-sized company, you'll have an ISSAFFB, you have a security officer that's the lead security officer for the company. In some cases, a chief information security officer. In some cases, it's just a security officer. What type of incident response plans do we have? Do we have an incident response policy? Do we have a disaster recovery policy? Do we have a data retention policy? Do we have an encryption policy? These are some of the policies that would come up in a typical situation for incident response to a breach or to a ransomware. And then how do you respond to this, right? So you've got a handful of computers that have been affected with this. What does that incident response look like? Does your company have a capacity to respond to an incident like that? Or do you just, who are the people to contact, right? And a good incident response for this type of scenario, you'd have a contact list. One of those people would be your chief legal officer or external counsel, right? Depending on the size of the company, you had internal counsel, external counsel. You contact them and say, hey, look, we've just been ransomed. What do we do? Because this gets into a legal territory of how do you respond as a business to this. You want to bring your best and brightest legal folks on board, as well as your best and brightest IT staff, and as well as your best and brightest security staff to help remedy this situation. Outside of your typical incident response team, what are the other teams that need to be involved, right? So if the business is being affected, the business leadership, obviously needs to be part of the conversation. If you've got vendor support, what are the vendors that can be brought in to help you with this? What's appropriate tools to respond? In many cases, if you have cyber insurance with the right cyber insurance company, they're also going to be contacted. And they also have hey, this is your 911 to us, and we're going to call X, Y, and Z. And if there was sensitive information that was a part of that as we sort of escalate this into, could this be a breach, right? So if you're contacting these folks, the chief legal officer and CEO will help to make the determination, is this a breach of confidential information? Legal has their rubric of that determination, whether or not this is a breach of information, specifically sensitive information, your PII, private information, or it could be, your human resource information. Those have been targeted as well, and as well as your financial records. So those are some of the bigger areas that ransomware will look to try to target, especially if you're a small company. A lot of cases, they'll put that on their computer, and that's where it'll stay for years, right? And beyond that, it sort of comes down to, as you're thinking through this and have the conversation, what's missing? What are the policies that are missing from here that you may not have as a small co or even a mid co? Well, a breach policy is one of those that until you cross that sort of threshold into, hey, I need to meet this regulatory requirement. A lot of companies, they don't have a breach policy. They're like, why would we create something that we don't need, right? So, but as you grow as a company, a breach policy is something that's being required. And in many cases, a lot of insurance companies are requiring a breach policy to be in place as a global policy for the company, no matter the size. As you look at those policies, what's missing? Yes, no, maybe so. when was the last time the plans for the incident response were reviewed, right? If you go through a good audit cycle, you'll completely forget that, hey, I got to do this every year as far as policies, plans, procedures, standards need to be reviewed annually. As you get into some more of these regulatory spaces, it's mandatory that you reevaluate these plans and policies annually, as well as do things and exercises such as penetration tests, and they have externals come in and do those reviews from a security standpoint and a compliance standpoint. And were there teams, as you have this broader conversation with the broader community within your organization, there's going to be teams that are not a part of that conversation, and they'll say, well, this team should have been a part of this conversation. Especially if you have a private data center, you're hosting a private data center, they'll say, well, we didn't bring in our backup folks. We didn't bring in the database administrators. We didn't bring in the facilities people that fuel the generators to keep us up, right? So in some cases, as you do these exercises, it's usually the second and the third tabletop exercise that provides the greatest value and benefit to the organization, because you figured out, in the first tabletop exercise, there's a lot that you don't know. There's communication plans that haven't been built or exercised in some time. And even though you may have a communication plan that was published this last year, those people may have changed positions or even left the company, right? And there's new people in those roles and have those responsibilities. So making sure those are up to date and flexing on those helps a lot. So as you get into the second time you do a tabletop exercise, a lot more can be revealed. And then in the third tabletop exercise, you've got just about everybody that's supposed to be at the table to have the conversation, to build a real resiliency into the company that can withstand some of the most challenging exercises. So that being said, from a ransomware standpoint, those are just a few of the approaches from an open discussion standpoint that you can take to help remedy a ransomware attack to your company, specifically Maze. And then sort of opening up this discussion a little bit further, does this attack exceed our capabilities to help respond to that, right? If so, this is never a binary type, yes, no, maybe so. It's maybe so. And then how much of assistance would we need from an external party to help us? Again, there's forensics, managed services, support services that can help a company, especially if you're hosting. In a lot of the cases, if you're hosting a lot of these companies yourselves, most companies there's some companies are still hosting all their information in their own data center, in their own private data center, in their building. If things happen, who's your support people to bring in? If you're running Cisco network hardware in your company, do you have the 911 to call, the Cisco team, right, to help you come in to help remedy any networking issues, right, for network outages? Do you have the right people from a generator standpoint? In some cases, okay, we've got power backups and that's good. Well, how many hours does that give you power for, right? Some companies, well, we only need 12 hours. So it goes into, as you look at the tabletop exercise, talking about recovery point objective and what that looks like for you as a company. What's that tolerance look like for you as a company? If you have one infected machine from a ransomware, it's not so bad. It's tolerable. But if you have 100 infected machines, that's where we're out of our comfort zone to respond. Our IT department, doesn't have the capability to respond to 100 infected machines at the same time, right? So at the small mid-co size companies, this is some of the challenges and sort of discussions you'll have with your constituency for your company. And okay, we're at 100 machines. IT's like, I don't have the capacity to remedy this issue, right? Who do you call, right? Bring in the right people and have the right people on call. In some cases, hey, we've got support services through Dell. If you're a Dell company, have Dell computers, or Lenovo or HP or one of the other big companies, and leaning toward some of the capability they can provide. In a case where there's no ransom or there's no sensitive information on the computer, oh, by the way, the ransomware is smart enough to know if you got sensitive information on your computer because it looks, right. It looks for photographs. It looks for these type of things, and it'll give a sort of decision matrix to the ransomware to make the determination whether it should make the ransom or not make the ransom, or pivot to another computer. And that's how sort of intelligent these attackers and these tools that attackers use, the ransomware, specifically the maze, are and have gotten over the years. So, do you have the capacity to respond to these? Do you need vendor support to help to respond to these? And in every scenario that real or tabletop exercise, the answer has always been yes, we need vendor support to help our organization to, remedy if we hit a threshold of more than, say, 10 computers, but 100%, we need help when we hit about 100 infected machines. And then bringing those vendors on to help, respond to those. So beyond that, looking at, the open discussion and continuing the conversation, recovery time objective, recovery point objective. I've always leveraged the term recovery time objective is what's your tolerance of having a service being down before you hit a threshold of I cannot tolerate this anymore and I'm losing money. The business is losing, but the business is losing money and it's not tolerable anymore. In some cases, the question will come up, and I've asked this question of clients: what is your material threshold for risk? And unless you're talking to one of the executives, most people are like, I don't know because I've never had to buy cyber insurance. But the cyber insurance company, if you have cyber insurance, they'll tell you exactly what your material threshold is for risk financially, as well as if you are audited financially, they'll tell you what your material threshold is for risk without missing a beat. But for IT practitioners like myself, and I'm sure you guys as well, is these type of conversations you rarely happen until you start having tabletop exercises or business impact assessments or business disaster recovery planning or continuity planning. You don't really have these type of conversations. So what is the appropriate amount of information a instant response plan should have? Well, it depends. It depends on how capable your internal team is to respond to these, if you have an internal team to respond to these, and how much of a support system do you have with your vendors to help support for something like that. And not just that, but if it's a physical type of an issue that's raised, have you met the local police officers and say, hey, I'm this business owner. I'd like you to come in and talk to my people, right? I'd like to, or you don't have to be a business. Hey, I'm a representative of this business. I've talked to our business. We'd like you to come in and talk to us about disgruntled employees or an active shooter, right? These type of things and these type of conversations provide value add to the resiliency to respond to incidents, and it also provides light that in areas that you as an individual you just wouldn't see before, especially in an active shooter situation. We don't, for the most part, people think that other people are good and would never do that sort of thing. But the reality of the situation is these things happen, and having a very honest discussion about these things can be very fruitful for you as a business. And then as far as recovery priorities, if you've got 100 computers, and again, I'm using the scenario that in the questions that we posed in this last slide, if you have 100 computers, what does that data recovery look like? If the CEO is hit, in many cases, it's a here's your new laptop and give it to the response team, so you're not going to miss a beat from a security or from a business standpoint. But we need a laptop to do forensics to see how this actually happened and how we can prevent this in the future, and what are the safeguards that we can ensure that are implemented and the controls that are implemented across the organization to prevent this from happening again. In many cases, some of this stems from not having multi-factor authentication, not having good access controls, not having good called the block and defense techniques from a defense standpoint defense in depth across your phone to your laptop to your desktop and so on and so forth. And as far as what data is lost, right? That's the big sort of question on the CEO's laptop. There's no telling what's on there, but anything that's on there is very much business related and at the top level as the executive. Specifically talking to this scenario, you want to make sure that it's a white glove approach and it's planned very professionally as an incident responder, that the plan is copacetic with the objectives and as far as the objectives for incident response, especially in a scenario like this. I have seen more value with giving incremental updates to everybody that's affected as well as the executives of the business, because, hey, this is happening now. This is what we're doing, and I'll give you an update in an hour. So you're level setting expectations of the who, what, when, where, why, and how. In many cases, the how is never really answered until you get more toward the end of the incident response. How this sort of thing happened, and why, in this case, why would our CEO be targeted? In many cases, the CEO will say, why am I being targeted? And part of that conversation is because you're the CEO is why you're being targeted, right? You would have the most access to financial information for extortion, for fraud, so on and so forth, and to try to blackmail companies as well. A good example of this here more recently is if you there's a podcast called Darknet Diaries, episode 117. Daniel the Paladin, I've just listened to this, speaks specifically to this type of committing fraud, committing extortion, blackmail, so on and so forth. So if you're looking for something external to this, Darknet Diaries has been around. It's a go-to, and it helps to sort of elaborate with a real life scenario of somebody that is committing the crime, and then is thus prosecuted, caught, prosecuted, and then his retribution story to help, sort of fix the challenges that he sort of created. But back to the scenario of the ransomware, are the communications appropriate and at the right time from a severity standpoint as well? In the incident response world, as you respond to these, specifically on the IT side of the house from a cybersecurity standpoint, you want to put a severity behind this, right? And your highest severity is everybody stops what you're doing and focuses on this. In many cases, I've stood up what we call tongue-in-cheek war rooms, where everybody's focused on this one thing, and it's an open channel, an open line. You can do it and just say, this is our open line, and everybody, when I say, hey, you, somebody's on the other side of that line that can respond and support the instant response. And then as far as distribution of the communication channels, right? So if you have a instant response plan, you want to print it out and you want to have a hard copy. And that it may sound like I'm old school, but that's from experience that it is beneficial to have a hard copy of your instant response plan printed in a 3-ring binder on hand than to not have it on hand. And so, and why is that important? Because if we'll just say that it hit 100 computers in this scenario, what if it becomes more widespread? What if the ransomware is spread through your entire company? Well, all you got then is your cell phone and a 3-ring binder to tell you exactly what to do. So, your primary response is to always have it, is to have it available to you, readily available to you. You have your backup, which is it's on a OneDrive somewhere. And the contingency plan is I've got a physical printed copy of this, and this is how we're doing this. As well as if you have an instant response and you have a war room stood up, you can have that in front of you and follow follow the playbook. So what is the recovery time objective? What is the recovery point objective? The recovery point objective is if we do not recover, come back to an operational status, we hit that material impact of the company, and we will have not just business is stopped, right, and I'm not able to deliver for the business, it can be isolated to a specific business line, or it can be widespread. So the business is crumbled. If you're very secular in your business and you say, well, I do this one thing very well. A lot of companies do that. They do one thing very well. If the company is affected by ransomware, they can't do that one thing to deliver to the customers. So 1 hour of loss could be tolerable, depending on your contractual obligations. But at 12 hours, 12 business hours, which I call is really like 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as you hit the West Coast. If you're down for 12 hours of business time, do you hit that material threshold? If not, okay, when do you hit that material threshold? 12 hours, 24 hours, 4 hours, 2 hours, 1 hour. For companies that work in the healthcare industry, as an example, if you're down for an hour, that patient could expire, right? Patient could die. If you're in critical services and you're not like a police department, right? And all the computers go down, you cannot provide ambulatory services adequately, and you go back up. And what was the backup? We bring the sheriff's department online to support the police department. But there has to be a plan in place to do that, right? And it has to be communication across the board, and it means and ways to do that in a meaningful way to build that resiliency, so that if something, your entire data center goes down, what do you do, right? And so incident response plan, and then the members of the team in the compliance role that I work in, having a great relationship with your legal team, having a great relationship with the human resource team has been very fundamentally of value to incident responders, to people who support the company in these type of incident response roles, so that if something goes bad and something goes south, you can get a legal opinion on what it is what are the legal implications for the company, what are the legal implications that could be avoided if you would have just called legal right off the bat in that scenario. So similar to that, human resources, if it's affecting the people of the company, having a voice from the human resources lead, whether it's your chief human resources officer, VP, or if it's just this is my human resources officer, if you're a small company, having them on board with that and communicating that to them as well, is because the people are affected. And if it's a small co, in some cases hey, I've got all my personal pictures on my work computer. I have that as my desktop background, and if it's lost, that's lost to me. And as well as for the ransomware standpoint, what does that reputational value look like for your company if you're hit by ransomware? Do you become devalued? Does your customers lose confidence in you as a provider to serve the customers? So a lot of these things sort of come up in these conversations with regard to what is the impact and the secondary, tertiary impacts down the road as we look through this from a planning standpoint. And then as you come to the end of the incident response sort of discussion, what does the after action look like? I've called it it's been called hot washes, but after action and lessons learned have been the sort of go-to. And for those of you that have done any sort of project management SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, you can do a Venn diagram. This has been the easiest way for me because it works. What are those areas of improvement, and what are the overall themes of improvement? In many cases, until you have done the tabletop exercise a few times, that communication tree is always a challenge. Knowing and having a verbal, okay, well, we don't have this documented procedures from a procedure standpoint. When do we hand this over to so and so? When do we have this shake between these two people? When does this escalate to legal? When does this escalate to our CEO? If the CEO is affected, who does he escalate to, right? In some cases, if you have a CEO that's on the road he may be infected, and it may be a very isolated issue where I've seen it where you just ask the CEO, send me your laptop in the mail. I've got a new laptop coming to you, and we can provision all the security services back on the laptop as it's come before we send it out to you. Same day, same day, overnight type things as well. But talking through what are the things we do well. In many cases, we've got, for many companies, knowledgeable people in the right roles in the company, skilled people in the right roles in the company, the tangible assets, people, process, and technology. For my ISO 27001, assets always have a people, process, and technology element to it, as well as many of the other standards. But what are the tangible assets that have the most value from an incident response standpoint? And what are those things that provide the most resiliency from an incident response standpoint? Who are the people that provide the most resiliency? And part of that is, if so-and-so is missing, do we lose that capability to respond? Do we lose the capability to respond in a meaningful way? And when I say in a meaningful way, as soon as you get hit with ransomware, the clock is ticking. If there's sensitive information in there, if it's sensitive business information like intellectual property, that can be that can bring a lot of very interesting conversations with your legal team as you sort of unpackage that. But what are the things that are, from a weakness standpoint, what are the things that are lacking, right? Like there's always the, hey, our competitors are doing this better than us type of conversation. What are some of the resource limitations from a overall theme standpoint? There's always going to be a resource limitation, and it can come down to this one person, especially if you're a mainframe shop. This one person hits the button to do the batch job overnight, right? Or to do the overnight type processing, right? But there has to be a person there to push the button to hit enter to do it. It's not automated, right? Because you get these sensitive system scenarios. But some of the weaknesses could be lack of resources. As you unpack these tabletop exercises, you say, well, we don't have a forensics response capability. Okay, well, we can outsource that, pay a vendor, an annual subscription, an annual type deal. If we don't use it, we get something back in return. But you want to have somebody on the hook to help support in these type of situations, specifically the resource capability that they can provide, and the capability they can provide in a meaningful way. In some cases, it can be some of the nuances in the process or a gap in the process as you're looking at it from a weakness standpoint, where there may not even be a process in place or a procedure in place to do if somebody fails. Like a good example, you got your primary contacts, your secondary contacts, and who's the contingency. In a lot of cases, there's not a contingency. So, especially if you're a smaller company, if so-and-so's asleep and they don't answer their phone, who do you contact next? And there may not be a next. There may not be anybody beyond that. Beyond that, if the CEO's down, CFO, so on and so forth. But you want to have a sort of hierarchy of who to contact, when to contact them, and your primary, your alternate, your contingency from a contact situation, a contact scenario. Some of the opportunities, where can we make, these incremental improvements, and organizational transformation, right? If a company is being bought or is purchasing another company, especially if you're a small co and you're getting bought out by a larger company, there's always an organizational transformation, specifically from a technology standpoint. I've worked for companies that would send you, if you were purchased by this company, they would send you all new hardware, all new network equipment, everything new, and then all the old stuff you'd send in, and then they would, clear all the information off the laptops and then recycle them. But again, they wanted to ensure that their controls were in place and operational prior to you getting access to their systems, right? And this is very much the case in banking. So identify technology to support growth and transformation. There is always a new fatter, with technology, with Moore's law, every 2 years there's better technology out there. There's better compute processing out there. But who are the vendors that are providing the best services? And more specifically, what are the best vendors that are providing the services that you need and provide the most value to you as a business? As you go from a small company to mid-co to a large company, with those growth spurts going from a mid-co to a large company, some of the vendors may not have the same relevancy as that you would need as a larger vendor. So, and if you're a smaller company, when I say the term SIM, they may not have even ever heard of a SIM or know what the value proposition of that is or how it can bring another layer of security to your company. But they may be familiar with firewalls. Okay, we've got firewalls in place. And there's a big difference between, having a good security control implemented well and managed well versus the security control is implemented, but nobody's behind it. Nobody's checking the firewall. Nobody's checking the instant IDS IPS. Nobody's checking the SIM technology. It's there, but the policies are alerting, but nobody's checking the alerts, right? And then this talk of the golden hour. So I like to talk through the golden hour, specifically to responding to a incident. The gold standard for incident response to an alert was posed by CrowdStrike, the CEO of CrowdStrike, with you got 1 minute to respond, you got 10 minutes or 1 minute to identify, 10 minutes to respond, and 60 minutes to close out the response. Because if you don't, the adversaries are exceedingly faster than you, and you will be ransomware. So what does that golden hour look like? And that same thing can be said as we explore other scenarios. Instant response to a disgruntled employee. Disgruntled employees and insider threats are two. You could run that as two separate scenarios or one scenario at the same time. You could have a disgruntled employee who knowingly and willingly puts ransomware or introduces ransomware into the system. They're disgruntled, they're wanting to leave. They're also, it could be, a cyber stalker, right? They could be harassing other employees. And then they can become disgruntled and get physical with another employee. As you scale up as a business, it is a reality that you'll face, that you'll have disgruntled employees and insider threats will become more prevalent for the organization. And there are tools to help support those. If you're in Microsoft, Microsoft has tools, Azure has tools. There are also vendors that supply tools to look at that in a meaningful way and provide good telemetry to make actionable some of these identifiers and say, it looks like this person is exfiltrating information from your company. It looks as though this person is doing X, Y, and Z to your company. It looks like this person has put your company's credentials on the dark web. And there's vendors to help support that and do that in a meaningful way to your company. So that being said, that's the incident response brief. We can open it up to discussion if you guys want to talk through some scenarios or explore some of the questions that I had in previous slides, or just have questions just about tabletop exercises in general.
Yeah, that was really great, Will. I definitely liked that perspective. I think on one of your first slides where you put the open discussion questions, I thought it was really interesting to kind of think about time to recovery and engaging the appropriate parties, right? Because as an incident responder myself, right, I'm thinking like something bad happens, ransomware, malware, whatever it is, doesn't matter, but it's affecting some system, right? And I was kind of thinking about this, as like a technical procedure, right? Like you might isolate an entire subnet. Like maybe you don't know the entire scope of the infection, but you could start with, isolating that subnet. But, during a tabletop exercise, right? You'd have the opportunity to identify, is your network even segmented in the first place? You know, and I think that's really interesting too, because I think some organizations, when they do tabletops, in the past, what I've seen is the tabletop involves only the cyber team. What would we do if, right?
Right.
So I thought that was really interesting for you to put that in perspective, to bring in other parties other than just, the cybersecurity folks. Um, and the other thing too that I found really interesting was defining the roles of the people participating in the tabletop exercises. Um, when you mentioned, people can get emotional, yeah, definitely have seen that, not just tabletop, but real life, because in real life, right, you're under pressure, management's under pressure from executives, everybody's stressed out, right? Um, and then during tabletop, right, you don't really have that, I would say, pucker factor so much, but um, people can easily get spunt up. Like if you have an incident responder who says something like, well, if the architects or engineers just built it the right way in the first place, we could have easily done this thing. We failed because somebody else failed, right? So I think that um, definitely, from my perspective, the people portion of it is probably going to be one of the most important things of the tabletop exercises.
Yeah. And again, communication, right? We've been working from home, for like the last 2 years. So coming back to the office and having conversations about, hey, how do we communicate in a meaningful way? And I've seen them done where you had a whole teams, but like if you have a whole teams room or a whole, WebEx room, it can become very crowded very quickly, right? And it's a different way to communicate. But when you're actually sitting in front of people, it can provide, I think, a lot more value um, from that perspective.
For sure. And I did have a question for you. I think it was one of your last slides, when there's like a weaknesses table, and I think the point was, what are we not doing as well as the competitors? And I think that was a really interesting point, um, because my question would be, do you think that it's more important to think along the lines of what are we doing not as, or things that competitors do better than us, or like how do they scale in all realms of, I guess, like the threat landscape? Because, or even like the incident response landscape framework, like we detect execution very well, more so than another company, but they do prevention more well than us. So I guess my question would be here, like, where do you think people should focus on when they compare themselves to other companies or competitors within their industry?
Yeah, so it comes down to if you're in a market industry vertical, healthcare, pharmaceutical, government, in energy, where do I call the Gartner, I use Gartner Magic Quadrant quite often, but, are you a leader? Are you a follower? Are you somewhere in between, right? And so, okay, cool. Forrester has, they're like, hey, here's where, businesses line up, but there are CISA, CISA, right, in the United States, they put out publications say, okay, this is the best practices. Are you doing these things, right? And so there's a tangible area to ensure that, okay, am I doing this better than so on than somebody else? In some areas like healthcare, it's easy to say I'm doing better than my competitors because there's a wall of shame in healthcare. If you get a breach, you go on the wall of shame and you never leave. You're there forever. There's also different hacker websites that you can get on, and you're on their wall of shame for not doing the right thing. So um, there's a few units of measure that you can use, as well as with some of these tools that are like, and I keep harping on Microsoft because that's my sweet spot. But this is what your overall security score is, right? This is what your overall compliance score is. How do you make improvements? How do you make, very meaningful impacts to your overall score that can make you more resilient to ransomware is a good example. To isolate laptops in a way where they can't cross communicate and really cross pollinate ransomware, right? The biggest ransomware exploits happen where computers are cross talking with each other where they shouldn't be cross talking with each other. Same network, no encryption controls, no firewall controls, things of that nature. And for companies, a lot of companies are like, well, they'll never hit us. If the premise behind that is that they'll never hit us, they're already in your stuff. You're already getting hacked. They just don't see you as a monetarily valuable asset to ransom yet. But there's that again, it goes back to this material threshold. As you go from a small co to mid co, you start getting on these lists. As you go from mid co to large co, you get on all the lists. When you're a large co, you're on all lists. You're on Fortune 500, list, Inc. magazine. Everybody's looking at you. You're the hotness. The same thing can be said from a ransomware standpoint. The adversaries are like, "Oh, this is the hotness. I know they've got money. I'm gonna try to get that money, right? I'm gonna try to use blackmail, fraud techniques. I'm gonna look at your supply chain, do open source intelligence on the company, build a whole profile. And oh, by the way, once we get you ransomware, our help desk team is awesome. They're the best, So, they're better than your help desk team. Right? So they have some of the best help desk technicians working for ransomware companies and cyber criminals, right? So, to placate to that, there's a monetary value that a company hits where they become more of a target for adversaries, and they may even just use you as a tool to pivot into other companies, as we've seen with some of the bigger exploits in the last couple of years. So, great feedback. Great feedback.
So this is great, and I'm looking at the weakness. I just wondering about this lack of resources. Could you kind of explain a little bit deeper on what kind of resources lacking?
Yeah, 100%. So there's always going to be a lack of people to do, security enough. Where's enough security? Because security is a spend for the company, right? So an IT, for the most part, is a consumer of funds. Security tools are expensive for the most part. At enterprise grade, security tools are expensive. So there's always going to be, and then the talent in IT security. Gosh, I think it was a 200 to 400% deficit 2 years ago for companies that were looking to hire security practitioners and qualified security practitioners looking for jobs. So there's always going to be a lack of talented security resources to support a company, no matter the size. And so accepting that as a truth, as a known truth, picking the right people to support you from a security standpoint, picking the right tools and the technologies to support that, and being very strategic and thoughtful, because the business drives, you as the business drives the technologies that you buy to support the business and support them and safeguard them in a meaningful way. But if the business can't afford the best of the best, I'll use Splunk as an example because I think Splunk is the best of the best, but they're the most expensive. They're the most expensive, and then you have to have a Splunk person to maintain, operate, and help to architect it in a meaningful way for the company. So, resources, people are going to be lacking. In some cases, it may not even be IT security people, right? It may be that the legal team is very limited with their staff. It may be that you may not even, as a small mid-co size company, you may not even have a legal team. You may not have any legal person. It may be completely outsourced. But until you start doing the tabletop exercise, you don't know who the people are that need to be doing the things that they need to be doing and when they need to do them. And in some cases, as an example, one of the examples I used is there may be just that one person. That's what they do, right? Database administrators. Some companies just have one person, or it may just be one IT security person, or it may just be one, and they're the whole show for the company, right? So, how do you remedy that? It's being very strategic in your security tools that you buy, the security people that you bring on board, the areas by which they specialize in, because IT is a specialization as a knowledge worker, right? And where's the biggest bang for the buck, right? So if you bring on an IT security person and all they want to do is data forensics, that's not helping out with your vulnerability score and where your vulnerabilities lie, right? And the things that provide the most protection. As far as if you don't have an internal auditor to help to check the checker to make sure security is doing what they're supposed to be doing, that's a very different type of conversation, right? And then beyond that standpoint is if you have a lack of resources from a strategic standpoint, how you may need to bring a company in to help build that strategic plan. Say year 1, year 2, year 3. This is what we need to do. This is the roadmap to do it, right? Especially if it is a instant response tool or capability that you don't have any sort of support with, right? It's a tool that was identified. Okay, we need a text messaging system in place to text message people to tell them not to come to the office, right? We've got a COVID outbreak, right? So you have to go through the entire proposal process. If you've got a project management board, change management board, that it's got to go through a board, it's got to be approved. You've got to do a review, due diligence to make sure that it's the right company for you, as well as a contractual review to make sure the contracts are in place to protect your company from from indemnity and liability and so on and so forth, as well as more specifically, is that company contractually obligated and compelled to support you as a business when the stuff hits the fan, right? Because in a lot of cases, if it's not contractually obligated and you do the ask for the vendor, hey, can you support me in this way? They're like, well, you're not paying for it, or you are paying for something, but it's not this, and we're not going to support you this way. So again, that the full circle, I call it full stack security, starts with, hey, we've got an issue, and it goes all the way from having the right people at the table at the time, and a backup, right? So if your primary HR person, if you're a mid-sized company, they may be out on vacation, ill. Who's the backup? And then who's the contingency? And then who has ultimately the authority in the company to make a decision? In a scenario where you have a disgruntled employee, who makes the decision for termination? Is it human resources? Is it the manager? Some companies do it differently. In many cases, it's usually human resources, but in a smaller company, it can be the manager. It can be in some cases, when you're a small company, it's only the executive staff that can make that decision, right? In some cases, with a small company, you may not even have a policy, like a sanctions policy is a good example. With a sanctions policy, it says this is how we're going to deal with issues that are involved nefarious type activity, lewd activity, disingenuous activity, and or doesn't follow good ethics as a reasonable person for the company. So there's just a few examples there.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Absolutely. Any other question? Okay, silence is golden. Well, thank you for your time today, guys. I appreciate it. Carlos, I don't have any problem with sharing this on the internet to all the people. But again, this is one of these things that it takes a little bit of time and the right people bringing them to the table for the tabletop exercise. And Builds resiliency for the company, builds resiliency for the employees, helps ensure safeguards are working, and people are communicating in case something comes up. And the weird things happen. You know, it's not just, hey, we've got a hurricane coming in, or hey, we've got so and so coming in. Hey, you could have a pipe burst, and it's the wrong pipe in the building, and it's bathroom water, right? It's the wrong kind of water. It's coming out of the pipe. And
Yeah,
I say that from experience. These things happen. So embrace the weird.
That's not funny.
Yeah.
That actually happened to that actually happened to my building this week.
Yeah, I think that's good though. Definitely, I think that doing the tabletops, like you mentioned, facilitates a lot of communication, but I think what it also does there is it provides the opportunity for everybody to start learning how to work with each other. You want to get it out of the way in practice before it becomes live and hot. That's, not an ideal condition, right? But yeah, I think you're absolutely right there.
Yeah.
Definitely appreciate the presentation. Well, I liked it. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, very thorough.
That's why we keep them around.
Yeah.
All right, Will. Thanks a lot. Wendy, thank you for joining us. I know we didn't have a super large group, but we hope you'll join us at next month's meeting.
Yes, very enjoyable. I'm glad I'm here. So I learned a lot. Thank you so much for the presentation. I definitely will come back again.
All right.
Excellent.
Starts with one. All right. We're a growing organization.
We recorded it, so we have video evidence of this. But, all right, everybody. Well, thank you for your time, and we'll see you next month.
Okay.
Yes.
See you next month.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.